Hi, welcome to Making Waves on Purpose. I'm Jeff Senny, and today I'm joined by Kyle Santos. I've known Kyle for years. He and I worked together when he was in the UK and worked on the UK sustainability consulting side. Then he joined the global corporate responsibility team. Then he moved to his native Trinidad and Tobago to be close to family and opened his own consultancy and worked with a number of companies there, and then moved to the States with his new wife and lives now in the Denver area and was with PwC and now is with Terumo Blood and Cell Technologies as their director of sustainability and ESG. Really great guy, really great insights. I'm delighted for him and his new position and delighted for the company to have access to his experience. He and I have, as always, a wide-ranging discussion, but one of the things that he picked up on that I think is really interesting and important is the need to celebrate small wins in the space while keeping an eye on the systemic change that we hope to drive with corporate responsibility or ESG efforts. There's a balance to be struck there. We're all acutely aware of the need to move fast and change the way that we operate business from an inequality, from a sustainability, from a wide range of perspectives. But that doesn't happen overnight. And we need to support ourselves and each other by celebrating the progress that we are making and recognize that progress, as well as being open and honest about the challenge that still lays in front of us. But great conversation with Kyle that I think you're going to enjoy. And with no further ado, I give you Kyle Santos. Kyle, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great to see you and hear you again. Tell us what you're up to these days.
Yeah, so since November, I left PwC, as you know, where I was the Environmental Sustainability Director. And I have joined Terumo Blood and Cell Technologies as their Director of ESG. Global role, it's a med device company that we make devices that collect, separate blood, which is quite a radical change from what I was doing before.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's two pieces to that. The global role, which you're uniquely suited to, having worked in the UK, the US, Trinidad, all over the place, and having run the West Cluster, if I remember my PwC terminology correctly. It's been a while. But, the Americas being the liaison there. So you've got a really good understanding of the global nuances of sustainability. But how's the transition from professional services into med devices? That's got to be interesting.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating transition. I mean, a very obvious learning curve, moving from one industry to the next one, as I say, service. Med device, essentially, we make stuff. We're a manufacturing company. It's manufacturing and shipping is sort of what it is at its core. So that's been a big change, but it's been incredible working for a company that we make devices that help save people's lives. Talk about purpose. It's really clear that is so front and center of what we do and is the highest calling, the highest version, purest distillation of our ESG approach and sustainability work. So it's been great. And also like in most industries, there's a lot of stakeholder pressure, whether it be regulators, customers, employees, definitely feeling the need to further our work on sustainability. So there's a clear need there.
It's interesting because in healthcare, there are some interesting tensions that don't exist in some other spaces. There's a natural desire to do more in the sustainability space, but you've got so many safety issues. So I know one of the problems in hospitals is waste, but who's going to say, yeah, we should reuse this tubing or these syringes or, safety is so paramount that it does seem shut down some conversations. But are you finding any of that, or it really is, do you feel the wind at your back a little bit?
That's absolutely the case in the sense that patient safety is paramount. That is number one. Thou shalt not do anything to compromise patient safety. That is clear. And it does mean, so we make devices. Each of those devices has a disposable that goes with it. It's like a plastic cassette that has loads of tubing and that has blood running through it. This is not something that can be sterilized and reused or recycled. They're disposable, called disposables for a reason. And at least with current technology, there is really no short-term or probably even medium-term option.
But as single single-use plastics go, it's certainly better than a Coke bottle.
It's better than a Coke bottle or a straw or a fork. Yeah, well, I'll give you that one for
It's
sure.
more useful. It's more useful because, like, I have to say, when I drink a soda or something, and you're thinking, like, okay, for me to have this drink, this now has to either be recycled or it goes to a landfill, whatever, for how much energy and resources have to be consumed so that I can have a drink, where it's a very different conversation to say, like, whatever the footprint is of that tubing, it's maybe saving a life, in which case it's worth it.
And I mean, I'm not going to pretend that they aren't stakeholders that don't say, well, are there options?
Sure.
So there's the clear patient safety element to it. There's also a regulatory approval design and all of that. So even if a company were to move in that direction, that is a significant investment of time, money, just to get to the point where that can even be considered for approval, far less getting approval. So, it's not really an area where we're concentrating too much at the moment.
I would think that might be an area for industry-wide cooperation. I mean, I could see a differentiation, like if you guys were the first to pull out some biodegradable or XYZ, whatever the sustainability attribute to those disposables would be, that it could be a differentiation. It also could be such that, maybe there's some broader industry play. But you and I have discussed recently, too, the kind of exchange between these big ideas that take so much lift and so the systemic change that is needed and this idea of like small wins. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing there.
Yeah, and I feel like people working in sustainability probably feel this tension a lot. I know I do. I felt it my entire career. I've been working in sustainability 16 years now, and I've never been able to shake this feeling where we're dealing with massive societal, environmental challenges that no one individual, no one company, no one country can solve. That sort of then necessitates system change, massive fundamental shifts in the way that we live, businesses operate, the society and economy works. Putting a solar PV system on a building then seems thoroughly inadequate. But that is progress. But doing the work that we do, which in so many ways is incremental, while trying to tackle these massive changes that are required, can feel quite humbling, make you feel pretty small at times. But I think those small wins, those incremental gains are absolutely critical. And we can't and shouldn't underplay the value that they bring.
I think that's absolutely right, because so much of what we're talking about is behavior change, mindset change, and kind of evolution. I'm thinking of the example of erosion. And erosion happens little bit at a time, little bit at a time, little bit at a time, and then the mountains.
All at once.
Yeah, it all goes at once. And so it is the series of many, many years, decades, or centuries of undercutting the rock, and then the rock collapses. And I think it's much the same in terms of behaviors and mindsets and perspectives, and especially in the modern moment where we're so hyper politicized, tribalized, and everything. I mean, ESG, which I'm still a bit baffled by, because the entire concept of ESG is that this is relevant to investors, which should be a very bipartisan agreement that, hey, this is a good thing, is yet politicized. And some of it is probably because of the excesses of the way in which ESG has been implemented or talked about. But some of it, too, is just like we are in a moment where whatever the other person says, that can't be right.
Yeah, and I think there's so much about sustainability and ESG that goes unseen and often unspoken in terms of the work that we all actually do. You don't go to a conference and hear about all the really, really tough work in the trenches, frankly, just grunt work that has to be done to, whether it's on scope 3, redesign of products, whatever it is, there's a huge amount of time and effort that goes in to each of these. Well, what you then see is you see the big flashy thing, you see the end result, you see the impact, and it's temptingly simplistic to just be like, oh, look at this beautiful thing that they achieved, and just ignoring everything that comes before. And I have seen companies and teams sort of fall into that trap a little bit, where for better or worse, the focus is on the big goal.
I think that's right. I think SBTI and net zero goals and DEI programs came out with this big bang. And I think, first of all, I think plenty of CR leaders duped their companies into signing up for things that the board and the executive suite had no idea what they were saying. But there was momentum, and so everybody kind of will paint the company into a corner and it'll all work out. I'm betting many of them are having tough conversations now of what have you gotten me into, and frankly, I'd rather be in a company that did it slower and step by step and really understood what it was asking of itself to get to a 2030, 2040, 2050 goal than one that kind of went along with the flow just because like that's what everybody else was doing and really didn't understand what this is going to.
Yeah, and that sort of touches on a piece around almost like license to operate, or license to operate sort of gives the impression of external license to operate. But I also think that sustainability teams need to often have to earn an internal license to operate. And you don't do that by saying, here's my one big goal, I'm going to go out and achieve it. You do that by demonstrating consistent successes. And what are those consistent successes? Often relatively small wins, compounding on top of each other, and in some instances that you described, until it all comes at once.
I love that. I think that's not sexy, and I think it's really true,
It's
though.
not sexy. It's not sexy at all. But I tell you what's even worse. Okay, it's not sexy. No one got into sustainability, at least not pre-2021, because it's sexy. That's
Right.
for sure.
Right.
Since then, maybe. But, came in because these are issues that you care passionately about and you want to make an impact. And that sort of leads to the willingness and ability to be flexible and resilient. Because I think flexibility and resilience are probably two of the spoken a lot about now, but some of the really unheralded skills and characteristics of a good sustainability professional. But just going back to a point, yes, those small wins aren't sexy, but what can undermine some of that resilience and ability to be flexible is when those small wins aren't acknowledged. I've seen instances where either teams don't sort of seem to buy into the value of small wins, and also then when those wins come, don't really acknowledge them. And that can have a really negative effect on the teams that are doing that work in terms of their motivation, engagement with the work and with the company and so on. So there's that side of it as well. Not just what you need these small wins to make progress. You need these small wins and these incremental projects and gains to keep people involved and motivated and engaged.
I think you're exactly right. I think there's a theory of change problem and there's a kind of practical problem. So there's a problem from the sustainability leader perspective is the sky is falling 1.5 degrees. We got to go. And so there's as you rightly pointed out, there's a social and an internal social pressure that many of us bring to bear on ourselves that, hey, we got to get this done because our children's future is at stake, which it is. Then there's the other piece of the business doesn't want to celebrate small wins because, that doesn't feed the PR engine. And so you get caught in this kind of like, what have you done for me lately? Like on this hamster wheel that you'll do something and then something. And stakeholders often don't understand where the real impacts. I've talked a lot to Jim Hanna from his time at Starbucks, and they focus on so much on the straws and the cups, which is not where the real impact is, but it's where their stakeholders feel the impact is because they've got this cup in their hand and they feel guilty about throwing it out. And I understand. So there's a lot of like cross currents here that kind of pile up to be suboptimal for celebrating small wins and moving the ball down the field and celebrating that.
Yeah. And you mentioned sort of that sort of feeling of guilt. For me, just going back to the point of operating in a space where we're trying to solve these massive challenges, and so much of our work is necessarily incremental. The imposter syndrome is real, especially when you're seeing some of the incredible things that companies are doing. Again, you're not seeing what's happening behind the scenes necessarily. So that is a real challenge. And I will say in my new role with Trumo BCT, there's a real balance to strike between supporting the achievement of our carbon reduction goals and making tangible changes in our sites to reduce energy consumption. And all this behind the scenes work, whether it be around compliance, measurement, governance, process, that frankly most people in the company will never see. And then there's the stuff that the people will see because these are the reduction projects, a recycling program, whatever it is. And getting that balance right, both in terms of the share of work and effort and resource, but also the share of airtime and the wins, is a real balance to be struck.
It's interesting. I'm working on a thought leadership piece with Steve Rockland from Impact ROI, and he and I have interviewed over 30 CSOs, and we're taking those interviews and trying to come up with like the state of the profession, in some ways, the modern moment and what we're seeing. And one of the things that we found is people who came up within sustainability, like you and I, see this compliance piece as, yeah, okay, we understand we've been wanting more of a compliance feel to this, but now it's become pretty onerous in a lot of these companies to really go through and figure all of these pieces out of implementing systems. And you and I know this from PwC. Like, we were lucky there because in the first year or two of me getting there, like, I had come out of the reporting space. So I was like, we've got to get our data systems in place. And boy, was I glad we did. Like, that really helped. But it took us years to get through that process. And now companies are running through it. Whereas CSOs came from within the business, like, are gravitating towards compliance because they're not worried about the materiality in the same way. And they're not struggling with the other pieces of, we've got to solve these pieces. They're like, this is what they told us to do. This is what we'll do it. So there's a really interesting kind of difference in approach between different kind of personality types or different experience types of sustainability professionals.
Yeah, and I think that also ties into the leadership's understanding of sustainability and ESG and to their objectives or what they want the impact of that to be on the business.
Right.
Because, for example, I've been having recent conversations where it's not about the sky's falling. Don't come ahead with risk, compliance. Yes, those are absolutely important. We need to be across those. But as you all know, it's about opportunity. Where are the opportunities for value creation in the business, and can we focus there? And it sort of ties into a conversation that I've had many, many times recently about measuring versus doing, and the risk and the compliance is sort of on the compliance side. Risk and compliance, is on the measuring side, and the doing quite often is on the opportunity side. And we're spending so much time on risk and measurement, and at least in my experience, not enough time on the opportunity. It's really challenging, especially, with these teams. These teams generally aren't very big.
That's fascinating. So how do we alchemize? How do we transform a compliance process into a management process that therefore makes it useful on the opportunity side? And we check the box, we comply with the compliance, but we turn it into a value creation exercise for the opportunity side of this rather than it being risk. This was another thing that came up in our conversations with CSOs, as well as the fact that I think one of the reasons that the CSO role like yours that is so challenging and why the small wins are so important is because there's few jobs within companies that are this multi-dimensional. You've got to work with comms and finance and research and development and operations, and you really don't have that. And it's a fairly adolescent practice. It's a fairly adolescent job. It hasn't been around like finance and HR and marketing and sales. And we still don't. The famous thing about marketing, we know half of all marketing works. We just don't know which half. And yet this has been going on for a long time. And sustainability arrives at the scene and we're like, we've got to get ROI from every dollar and blah, blah, blah. So I think one of the challenges is the multidimensional aspects of those jobs and how that can be a real challenge.
Yeah, and I do think if done well, that stakeholder engagement itself can almost inherently create value, because quite often you're connecting people and teams and having them sort of layer in ways of thinking about what they already do that they haven't been doing before. And that quite often can bring about some important insights and change. Going back to the compliance piece and how do you sort of shift that to be a value creation piece? So that I think is very tempting. CSRD is on my mind a lot these days. We just launched an RFP to support with that work. It's very tempting to just almost assume we're going to go through this process and ta-da, there's going to be magic value created at the end of it. Because we're going to understand our material issues more, we're going to have better measurements in place and so on. Don't think that you can take that for granted unless we go through that process actively seeking out opportunities for value creation and benefits for the business beyond compliance and better measurement. I think you can easily get to the end of it and say, okay, we're compliant, but we still haven't really shifted the needle on many things. You have to go into that very deliberately and almost with an approach to say, here's how we're going to do that.
Well, and I think, back to this work I'm doing with Steve is we found that, and you hit it exactly on the head, which is you said, what does the company want to get from this? That's the key question, which is, I think, too many companies hire for this role and see sustainability and don't really understand there's a value creation question that you need to ask yourself. And so we've I don't want to give too much of away, but we've identified 5 or 6 different drivers or what we're calling archetypes. And it's like, do you want to be a brand leader? Do you want this to be part of your PR campaign? Do you want this to be about innovation and change? Do you want this to be about immediate return or long term? Or are you an impact? Like you're really like Patagonia is really an impact company. There's plenty of other companies that use it as a means of innovation, or they want to constrain costs and use it to return more in the short term. So there's lots of different personality types that show up with this. And knowing the personality type of what you want to be, what you want to get out of it is absolutely key. And I'd say a lot of companies don't know.
I agree that a lot don't necessarily know. And how do you guard against that shifting as leadership changes? And I think that's where having an entire leadership team that is bought in and that this is what we all agree we are trying to achieve is where you can sort of guard against that part, rather than being an individual, an inspirational CEO or someone saying, this is what I want to get from this. But, the rest of the business perhaps not necessarily bought in or has a different perspective. And that can be industry specific. I mean, I'm not suggesting that is the case in my new role, but healthcare is probably as heavily regulated as you get. So there is a temptation for it to just be around compliance. But I'm very happy to say in my role that that's absolutely not been the case so far. We're definitely seeing this as a business opportunity, value creation.
Well, and I love that this idea of like business opportunity, value creation makes it a ballast so that it doesn't fall to the whims of which way the wind is blowing.
You were mentioning the sort of ESG pushback. And ultimately, that's why many companies perhaps are saying less or saying things differently. I'm sure there are, but I haven't seen a lot of evidence to demonstrate people are investing less or doing less, because for the most part, they're seeing it create value. They see value in it. So there may be things that sort of fall by the wayside. And that's probably a natural culling of projects that were not really aligned to what's core to the business. And some people may say that's a bad thing. I don't think so. I think that's natural.
Yeah, I think some culling is probably appropriate. I also think some amount of code switching is probably okay, corporate code switching, depending on, you're speaking to your audience a little bit. I don't think you can be inauthentic, but I think you can tone down if you're talking to somebody who is going to be particularly animated by your DEI program, either for or against or what have you. I think, we all naturally do that. And I think we would do that with core values. I'm not going to say, we're for X, and then over here, I'm going to say, no, we're not for X. But I think if D&I is your thing and you're in an audience that necessarily isn't as supportive of that, toning that down, is that appropriate? I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question because there is an argument to be made that no, you're not advancing the cause if you're not out there screaming it from the rooftops. I'm not sure how well that's worked out for us, with 19 attorneys generals suing XYZ for their woke policies. So yeah, it's tough in the modern moment. I'm super excited for your new role, and it sounds like you're doing some great work.
Yeah, I feel like we've hit the ground running. We've just confirmed a new hire where we're going to be hiring someone in Europe to support this work. So it is really, really important for the business. It's important for many, many of our customers. So yeah, I'm excited to see what we can achieve.
Well, they're lucky to have you, and I'm excited to see where it goes from here. Thanks for joining us, Kyle.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.